Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, we last chatted with Donna Edwards during her successful campaign to unseat 8-term incumbent Al Wynn. She's campaigning again, this time for healthcare reform and against war. Public fear of catastrophic climate change has triggered hope for a nuclear industry revival. But Allison Fisher of Public Citizen cautions, not so fast. Urban gardeners are sprouting everywhere, and discovers filmmaker Cintia Cabib they're about more than fresh produce. We've got poetry by Rei Berroa and Brian Gilmore.
Dred Scott, Martin King, King Martin, King Rodney, King Dred, the King of Dred, the Reverend King Scott Martin Dred is a liar.
And the out-country sounds of Whammy winner Randy Barrett on the Coffee House. Welcome to the forum at the Coffee House, where we're joined by one of the fresh and refreshing new faces in Congress, Democrat Donna Edwards, who represents Maryland's 4th Congressional District outside Washington, D.C. In February of last year, she defeated long-term incumbent Al Wynn in the Democratic primary and then won a special election to fill the remainder of his term at the end of May. She easily held that seat in the November election and now serves on the Transportation and Infrastructure and Science and Technology committees. She's an active member of the Congressional Black Caucus and the Progressive Caucus in the House. Welcome, Congresswoman, back to the Coffee House.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
So we're going to have health care reform this year.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm convinced about it. In fact, I think that, all of the ruckus that we went through and during the summer and now into the fall, we're going to get a strong health care package that we can get to the president, have him sign it into a law, and the American public will know that whether you have a job or not, you have health care reform.
There was a recent CBS New York Times poll that showed that 2/3 of the American public supports a public insurance option in the bill. Yet, very shortly after that poll was released, the Senate Finance Committee voted against including a public insurance option in their reported bill. What do you think is going to happen here, and why do you think that happened?
Well, that's one bill of 5. 4 of the bills, actually, that have been reported out of committee, including 1 on the Senate side and 3 in the House, all have a public option as a component of that. I think that as a member of the House, our job, and I've encouraged our colleagues to do this, is to stay focused on developing the strongest bill possible in the House of Representatives. I believe that needs to include a public health insurance option that competes in the marketplace, lowers costs, provides competition, and I think that we can get from here to there.
So what's the deal with the Senate Finance Committee? Why, in the face of such overwhelming public sentiment in support of a public insurance option, including a majority of Republican voters?
Well, I think that's exactly the right question. I think part of what is going on in the Senate is just about good old-fashioned politics and lobbying, and that we have a health insurance industry that's very vested in the status quo, others who are vested in the status quo. The president wants to change that game, and the majority of the American public understands that a public option will provide real competition. And you've never seen an issue that's been beaten up so badly, but still enjoys that kind of majority support. And that's why I believe at the end of the day, we'll develop a really strong, robust public option coming out of the House of Representatives, and we will preserve that in the end. I mean, there's majority support among Democrats in the Senate for a public health insurance option, and we have the obstacle of process of getting through one committee so that we can get to a final bill.
Author Michael Pollan wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times in September suggesting that the real important issue wasn't the public insurance option, but instead it's making sure that pre-existing conditions are covered. And he said that because what's driving the health care costs, twice for the costs for Americans as in Europe, is that we're getting fatter, we're getting obese, we're getting diabetes, we're getting heart disease, we're getting cancers from the food we intake. And he believes that if you were to force the insurance companies to take people with pre-existing conditions, which I know you support, what that would do is it would force the insurance industry to fight the food industry over the high caloric, poor nutrients that they put in the foods.
Well, that all may be true, but it still won't further what the president has identified as goals for healthcare reform of providing competition, making sure that we have a system where there's real accountability, and making sure that we lower costs for everyone. And that's the value of the public health insurance option. And I don't think it stands alone. I mean, we have to do all of this, and it's why it's so complicated. We must eliminate exclusions for pre-existing conditions. We can't allow insurance companies to just drop people after they've taken advantage of all the money that they put into the system. We have to invest in prevention and wellness and in strengthening our provider system so that we have family practice, general practice physicians who are trained to take care of all the patients. So we have to do a lot of things with this bill. The public health insurance option, I think, is a critical component of that, but none of these things stands alone.
Okay, well, let's move over to Afghanistan, which some people, I think the president included, has described as the good war, relatively speaking, at least compared to Iraq. You're on record as saying that we need an exit plan. We need to know what it is that we're fighting for, what is victory, and what is our goal there. In your mind, what is our goal in Afghanistan? What is it worth fighting for there?
Well, I want the president and the administration and our military, apparatus to really describe this for us, because I think it's really important. I mean, one of the reasons I actually didn't support the supplemental appropriations earlier in the year is just prior to that I traveled to Afghanistan. I had a chance to talk with our military leaders on the ground, with Afghani military leaders, with our civilian sector, State Department, NATO officials, and I was not convinced at all that we had a plan or a strategy for Afghanistan. Afghanistan, after all, is a country that is still living in about the 16th century. Needs to be, if that's the investment, brought to the 21st century. It's a very different animal from Iraq. All Taliban are not Al-Qaeda, and all Al-Qaeda are not Taliban. The fighting that's ensuing in Afghanistan in these mountain regions and small villages buried between the mountains, it's a very different kind of war, and I think it's important for the president to lay out with great clarity what our goal is and what our exit strategy is. And some experts are suggesting that we could be, if we make that investment, we could be in Afghanistan for as long as 20 years, 2 decades. And even at the end of that, we might not end up successful.
Well, certainly the experience of the British and the Russians before us isn't suggestive of an easy success. And the American general there is suggesting perhaps 40,000 more troops.
Well, General McChrystal, in the report that was pre-released to the press, which I have all kinds of problems with, because I think it's important for military advice to be given to the president in a way that he can take it in from all of those sources and make good decisions from that. And so I don't like the idea that we're playing that military advice out on the front pages of the papers and in the news media, trying to force the president's hand. That said, I mean, I think the report was leaked, and General McChrystal seems to be suggesting that we need 40,000 additional troops. That still doesn't explain both what we're going to do and how we're going to get out. And I think that those are important questions that absolutely must be answered. But I'm not convinced at all, reading from a lot of different sources and talking with folks who are on the ground, that the kind of investment we need to make is predominantly non-military. It's investment in education, particularly in girls' education and crop development, and developing a civil society structure with a central government that, by anyone's definition, is corrupt. And people in provinces don't even trust the central government.
But what about the idea, I think Vice President Biden has advanced, that we should be sharply distinguishing the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and that a military strategy should be targeting Al-Qaeda and not the Taliban?
Well, as I said before, my limited experience, and I'm not going to claim to be an Afghanistan expert, but suggests, of course, that Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and the Taliban are not one and the same, and that there might be, ways of making, decisions about what happens in various provinces or other, and from one province to the next province, there are differences. So this is very complicated. It's not at all as though we can just sort of train up a law enforcement force and a military force in Afghanistan that's indigenous to Afghanistan in the kind of way that we did with Iraq, because that's never been Afghanistan's experience. And so we can't simply sort of transport one strategy from Iraq over to Afghanistan. And I don't think it's enough to make the argument that we've simply, because we've been there since 2001 and it started out as the good war fighting terrorism, supported those, those goals, that doesn't mean that that's necessarily the assessment today. And I want the president to be able to make the kind of assessment that says, where are we today and where do we want to be tomorrow?
Okay, I want to move to a different foreign policy issue. And in January, I believe, there was an issue about people in Gaza firing rockets into Israel, and there was a vote, sense of the Congress resolution that passed with 305 to 7, I believe, in support of Israel's right to retaliate against Gazans and go against Hamas. And you voted present. Tell us why.
I did. I voted present for two reasons. One, because when the resolution came to the floor of the House of Representatives, the United Nations had acted just the day before. I thought it was the purview of the United Nations to act. The United States actually, supported the UN's actions in calling both for a ceasefire and on both sides, both the civilian problems that were happening over in Gaza, and also the rocket fire over into Israel. And so I thought it was really inappropriate, actually, for the Congress to be acting at all in that way. I since had a chance, actually, to travel to the area. I traveled to Israel, I traveled into Gaza, and also to the West Bank. I met with people who shared a wide range of viewpoints. I think one of the most striking things in my visits to Israel, meeting with the press, meeting with political leaders and civil society leaders, is the wide range of debate and discussion that takes place in Israel and doesn't take place here in the United States. And I think that we have an opportunity to engage in a different kind of way in the region, and I really support, actually, President Obama in taking this issue on from the beginning of his administration. Too many presidents have waited until they were in political trouble domestically and then engaged in the 11th hour, and I just think that hasn't been helpful to the security and stability of Israel, and hasn't been helpful to the stability in the region. In my view, the president has said several things. He said, look, we want to make sure that Israel does its part, and he's called for an end to settlement development. But he's also said, in the West Bank, Palestinians have responsibility too. They have responsibility to develop their governance structure, to make sure that they work, and to validate the security of Israel. And he said there's work to be done in Gaza and with the partners among Arab League nations. And that means that all of us have a role to play in the long-term peace and stability in the region, and toward actually stop just talking about a two-state solution and doing things very intentionally and deliberately with the United States as part of the picture to move toward a two-state solution. And so those are things that I continue to explore and continue to raise here in our congressional district, because I think we owe it to ourselves, all of our congressional district, to have this discussion and debate, because it's important to the long-term security of the United States.
You're on the Science and Technology Committee, and one of the issues, one of the approaches to solving the problem of climate change is the suggestion that we can sequester carbon in the ground. And there are lots of ideas about clean coal, that we can sequester the coal and the carbon from the clean coal in the ground, and therefore we don't really have to change too much how we produce energy. What are you learning in that process, and what are your views on that?
Mark, I'm not convinced. We've had a couple of hearings actually on the Science and Technology Committee looking at exactly, this question. I mean, the fact is that that technology is so far down the line, we're going to have to make, billions of dollars of investments to get to a place where we can, where we believe we might have a technology that works. When that happens, we will be long past our peak carbon days. And so I'd much rather take this, these precious resources, because we only have so much money to spend, and actually invest it in renewables that we know will work, but we have to make investments all across this country in a new grid that can handle these different technologies. And no one has convinced me yet that carbon sequestration is going to meet with any success, and to the extent we know it, it's going to be 20 years down the line, and by that time, our children and some of our grandchildren will be paying the price for an environment and an earth that's just been scorched because we haven't dealt with the carbon problem.
Part of our environment in this region is the Chesapeake Bay. You've been very active on that front. You were able to introduce an amendment to include the Bay in a coastal research and action plan. Tell me about that.
Sure. I mean, I introduced this amendment actually just recently to include the Bay and the Great Lakes region, because, the Chesapeake Bay is the largest estuary in the country. And so it's a tremendous resource for the Chesapeake Bay watershed states, but also for the country. And I think it was important to come up with an action plan and a strategy for the Bay, and included that, in that little provision. Those amendments that you talk about, and you do it behind the scenes. The president has said that the Chesapeake Bay and cleaning up the Chesapeake Bay is a top priority of his, and I think in every avenue we can, through this administration, we need to use every available tool to make sure that throughout the watershed we're doing the kinds of things that will result ultimately in improved health of the Chesapeake Bay and, the continued commercial and environmental viability of the Bay and its habitat.
You've taken on an issue that I haven't seen anybody else raise in the past. I think when most of us go into restaurants, we just assume that whomever is waiting on us is going to live off of whatever we give them, and because they're not going to get much money from their employer. But you've introduced legislation to do something about that. Tell me.
I have. The wages for employees who work for tips, and sometimes that's in restaurants, but there are other areas in which employees work for tips. That is, they make a minimum wage that's basically been the same since I think about 1996 and hasn't changed, even though the regular minimum wage has actually gone up. And so there's that gap, and they're forced to make up the remainder of their income in tips. And in this kind of economy, you can imagine that if you rely for your living on those kind of wages, you're in quite a bind. And I'm one of those. I used to wait tables, so I understand that. I understand what it means to try to meet the rent with your tips and not really counting on them. And I think we can't continue to have these income gaps from those who are in who are most vulnerable and really struggling to pay their bills and take care of their families. And it's the right thing to do. Again, these wages have not been raised. They've been frozen, in fact, since 1996, and where the regular minimum wage is about $7.25 an hour, tipped employees work for about $2.15 an hour. Most people don't know that.
Yeah, well, and it's a serious thing. And I always feel like when I go into a restaurant, it's unfair if I go into a diner, for instance. I know that the prices are lower, and so if I use the same percentage to tip, that particular wait person isn't going to get nearly as much money as somebody who may have served me not nearly as well at a more highbrow restaurant.
Right, and some of the finer restaurants, of course, the employees, the wait staff there actually, I mean, they're able to make rather, significant amounts in their tips, but, an awful lot of folks don't work for those restaurants. And so I think it's really important, and it's always a tough call on these issues, especially given the economic burden that both our small businesses and our workers are facing. But we do have to get, again, from here to there, and sort of bring up all levels of income. And I have to tell you, I mean, this question about what we do on healthcare reform deeply impacts what's happening to our small businesses, and a lot of them would be able to afford some of the things that would raise wages if they didn't have to bear the brunt and the burden of providing health care for their employees, and bearing more of the burden than some of the larger employers because they are so small and have no leverage.
We're just about out of time. Very quickly, you're with both the Congressional Black Caucus and Progressive Caucus. One major hit that the administration took was the apparent forced resignation of Van Jones as the advisor to the president on green jobs after Glenn Beck pushed that incessantly on Fox TV. Any reflections on that?
Well, I've known Van Jones for a very long time, long before I came into the Congress, and I think that Van, along with any number of us, could have been caught saying some things that, may not have been appropriate and that we regret. I think it's a horrible environment when one talk show host, who really only reaches maybe 1 million people, if that, has the capacity to undermine what a president of the United States wants to do. And I don't think it's right, and I think it's really dangerous for us to go down that road where we're singling people out and going after them. It really harkens to a different era in this country, one that I don't think we want to repeat.
Well, many thanks to Representative Donna Edwards for visiting with us and sharing your views on many of the critical issues of the day. We expect you will continue to be a formidable voice for a more equitable and caring America and a peaceful and balanced foreign policy. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been Coffee House Forum.
That woman in bloom who came to the house almost at midnight, her mouth full of pensive doves like so many shadows, full of the hot throb of many ovens, who brought her bread wide open, her tongue wet and her yeast ready for baking, to whom I too opened my hearth so she wouldn't suffer solitude, absence, delirium, or cold, offered me willingly what she brought. She sat at my table and drank my wine. We shared bread in equal parts and sang love songs, and I curled up in her valleys the best I could. So, let's stalk each other, dove, she said, and all dove and stalked we settled in. Sheets and senses trembled like leaves in a blush of rain. Our pulse unseamed, we began to gallop, tethered to the breasts of darkness like starving waves sating all at once their far-off emptiness. We mounted on the savory flanks of night and flew in search of lovers' lanes. Once in Quito, we rode upon a lake before a spur point nailed us to the shore and left us dreaming. We laughed in Lima with Chabuca as our witness, searching on the balcony for missing blooms of cinnamon. Then to Santiago, on the same red bench where on that other 11th of September, 2 scorched doves had fallen dead in my arms, 2 doves that one October 2nd in Tlatelolco had fled the butchering of the 3 cultures, with stops at every lover's lane and a warning for all who love. Death draws near, dancing among invisible plains, bringing scrolls for us to sign away the oil in our rocks and then assume a government they claim of late to have invented. Here comes death, and one must flee the indignity of those who sell their heritage for a plateful of lentils and masturbate alone with God's name on their tongue. 7 days and 7 nights later, the postman left me a document signed and sealed, accusing me of sensual harassment. 4 days, 4 nights was all I had to appear before the law. 12 months later, I was absolved for lack of proof and witnesses. And since they found upon repeated tortures that the one who laid the accusation against my misbehavior had neither name nor fingerprint, nor ever could be found in any book of church or state, of time or insult or desire, it must have been another one of those who slither from the pages of a book and believe they are, or were, or perhaps will be someday. Must be I didn't show the scar I have still oozing on the left side of my shadow, nor have I said again a single dove in Cupid's ear. I, who always thought we were not just sailboats or kids aground in Edens or Kamalas or Macondos, but one single flow of lights in history, kisses like a fragile stir of wings falling on the altars of this ashen dust, of love and voids of love, of nakedness and nothing.
Welcome to 21st Century Life here at the Coffee House. It's been 30 years since the 3 Mile Island nuclear power incident, and America has yet to commission a new nuclear power plant in all that time. But with climate change and a renewed national focus on energy independence, several nuclear power plants have been proposed nationwide, new ones, including a massive facility just 50 miles from the nation's capital in the state of Maryland. But is America really ready for a quote-unquote nuclear renaissance? Supporters claim that energy is low carbon, safe, and cost-effective. If France can get over 70% of its electricity from nuclear power, why can't we? Here to discuss this issue is Allison Fisher. She's an energy specialist with Public Citizen, a national consumer advocacy group headquartered in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the Coffee House.
Thank you.
First of all, there have been no nuclear power plants commissioned in the United States in 30 years. Why?
That's right. It's interesting. People actually think that 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl were the cause of what's now a very dormant industry. In reality, a new nuclear reactor wasn't commissioned after 1978, and TMI happened in 1979, so at that time the industry was already pretty much over. The reason is that that first wave of nuclear reactors had so many cost overruns and so many issues and delays that it actually was a huge financial boondoggle for both taxpayers, ratepayers, and for the federal government.
So you're saying even apart from the safety issues that the industry was having financial problems?
Correct.
And these were it wasn't just the cost overruns, but these things were taking a really long time to build.
Absolutely, and the longer that it took, the more money that had to keep getting sunk into these reactors. Of all of the reactors that were on the drawing board at that time, only half of them got built. In terms of cost overruns, the Department of Energy later did a study and found that 75% of the reactors that were built were actually 200% over cost. So long before 3 Mile Island and long before Chernobyl happened, this industry was already pretty much doomed. There was, just to highlight this idea, Forbes magazine 1985 on the front cover said that the nuclear industry was the biggest managerial disaster in the history.
Well, where did that disaster go? I mean, why is there suddenly such a new interest in nuclear power? I mean, both President Obama and John McCain said good things about nuclear power during the presidential election. You hear tons about it now. Democrats in Congress are proposing it. Why this renaissance?
I think the renaissance, has been initiated because of the current context that we're living in, and that is, climate change, the need for energy independence, a host of reasons why the nuclear industry has been able to reinvent themselves.
Well, is it a solution to global warming? You say it's not. Why not?
Absolutely not. There are numerous options that are also low carbon that are far superior to building nuclear power plants. nuclear power is actually the worst option, the least cost effective. You're going to get your least bang for your buck if you build nuclear reactors.
Well, one of the things you've said that I wasn't as aware of is that these things take so long to build for lots of different reasons, regulatory concerns, construction overruns, et cetera, and that the climate clock keeps getting shorter and shorter. In other words, nature's deadline of quick action now to cut carbon doesn't necessarily accommodate the complicated nuclear construction.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it was just a couple of years ago that James Hansen said we had about a 10-year window before the worst, effects of climate change were going to be, upon us. And even if a nuclear proposal was approved today by the government, it still would take a decade for it to come online and produce electricity. So, clearly this is not a solution that we even have time to consider.
Well, how has France been able to do it? I mean, over 70% of their electricity is nuclear. All these concerns that you outline, do they not have those in France?
They certainly do. One of the things that we haven't talked about as a key issue to nuclear power is the waste issue. Still a huge problem. There's about 50,000 metric tons of waste that are sitting at commercial reactors all across the United States. It's a solution that we have not been able to come up with. No country in the world has. France is no different. They also reprocess their waste, which means they create more waste streams. They create plutonium, which is weapons grade materials. So they have incredible waste problems. They have reliability issues because they are so dependent on nuclear as their power source. If anything happens to a reactor, or for example, if there's a heat wave and the reactors are too hot to be able to operate, they have to shut them down. They have no backup power.
Well, I mean, going back to the cost issue, however, because that's just always the issue that comes up most, it seems, in terms of criticism of nuclear power, especially here in the United States. There are those who say nuclear power is expensive, yes, but it's because of people like you and Public Citizen and the environmentalists and the watchdogs
Sure.
that make it just so hard to build and so
Sure.
costly.
Right. Well, here in the United States, we do have the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is the regulatory body that oversees the nuclear industry. And from my perspective, I would think that the last technology that we want to weaken in terms of regulations is nuclear power. The consequence would be too great. In terms of France, they have a similar regulatory body. But the reason why they're actually able to have the nuclear power plants that they do is because they have nationalized energy. So they don't have...
So it's subsidized by the government.
It's subsidized by the government.
Well, what about, speaking of governments, the United States government is centered in Washington, D.C., and the first power plant that might get built in this renaissance, the lead runner in terms of proposed power plants, is just right outside of D.C. in Maryland, in Calvert County, about 50 miles away. Going back to the cost issue, Constellation Energy, which is proposing this power plant, said in 2002 this would cost about $2 billion. What is their official estimate of the cost now for this new reactor?
Right. So when the proposal first hit the papers in Maryland, you're right, it was about $2 billion is what they were quoting. Then they were really silent for a long time about the cost estimate. It wasn't until last summer that the Constellation executives said in testimony before the Public Service Commission that it's probably going to cost closer to $10 billion.
So an $8 billion increase in 7 years.
Right.
Is this typical of the kind of escalating costs of these power plants?
It's very typical, and historically, these are the kind of issues that brought down the industry and are the reasons why there hasn't been one built for 30 years. And it's not just a historical issue. There's actually an experience happening in Finland right now that is very much reflective of this issue. It's the same reactor being built by the same people that want to build in Maryland that at this time are 3 years behind schedule and $3 billion over budget. So we're seeing history repeat itself already, and it should be a very clear signal that this is not the way to go.
Now, none of these power plants has been officially and finally approved. They need a federal license. They're still going through their state public service commissions. But if not nuclear, then what? I mean, there are a lot of folks who say, you know, it's low carbon. If you don't want coal, then you need something like nuclear that's, you know, base load type electricity. It can run all the time. If you think that nuclear is expensive and doesn't make sense and not safe and construction delays, what are the alternatives?
Right. So it's a great question. The reality is that, you know, there's misinformation that says that we have to either have coal or nuclear, and that's completely erroneous. When in actuality, you know, a combination of renewable energies, which include wind, offshore wind, solar, geothermal, great new technologies, wind and tidal and some other things, in combination with energy efficiency is where we need to go, and that can actually meet our demand. In terms of resources and investment, dollar for dollar, renewable energy and energy efficiency is going to deliver more energy than nuclear power.
So great example.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Great example is energy efficiency. I don't think people talk enough about it. It's not as sexy as a lot of the other technologies. It's the low-hanging fruit. It's something that we should be doing right now. For example, you know, $1 invested into energy efficiency is going to give you 5 times more energy than a nuclear power plant. In Maryland alone, a report was done a couple of years ago that basically said if you are to implement a very robust energy efficiency plan, that you won't even have to consider building a new nuclear reactor for the next decade. So this is very powerful stuff.
Well, a really big thanks to Allison Fisher. As the global climate continues to heat up and oil discoveries go down, nuclear power will surely continue to be a topic of national discussion. But whether consumers and ultimately politicians can afford this option is yet to be determined. I'm Mike Tidwell, and this has been 21st Century Life.
Dred Scott, Martin King, Rodney King, Dred King, Martin Luther Scott, Dred Luther Rodney, Rodney Luther King, Rodney Luther King. The Reverend Dr. Rodney Luther King was pulled over last night by the Los Angeles police in Memphis, Tennessee, and taken to the Lorraine Motel. He escaped, got a few blocks down the street, but he was caught and brought back to the motel. They asked him, where did he work? He said he hadn't had a job in quite a while. Now and then he preached sermons. They told him he was lying. Dred Scott, Martin King, King Martin, King Rodney, King Dred, the King of Dred, the Reverend King Scott Martin Dred is a liar. He was free. He was on the balcony. He was unarmed. He was a minister. He was probably drunk. He was driving drunk. He was resisting. He was a resistor. He had been to the mountaintop. He was a man of peace. He wanted to march Los Angeles, Missouri, Memphis. He had seen Wisconsin, the Promised Land, the court settlement. Rodney Martin Dred King, Scott King, a drunken liar, a man with no real job, driving skills, a man who preaches an occasional sermon, almost died a slave on some balcony in Los Angeles, surrounded by cops with stun guns, batons, explanations, Supreme Court orders, caught on film by Francis Ford, Steven Spielberg, Soderbergh, Coppola, Orson, Frank Wells, Capra. That is exactly how it happened. I watched it without any buttered popcorn. Some loud, drunken minister resisting arrest in the 19th century. A war will be fought over a movie. Chances Are by Johnny Massis is the theme song. Anybody seen Ken Burns?
Welcome to Rewind at the Coffee House, where we plan to join a veteran filmmaker's exploration of the blossoming field of community gardening. Cintia Cabib has been visiting community gardens in Washington, D.C. and is here for a show and tell about what she's seen and learned. Welcome to the Coffee House, Cintia.
Thank you for having me.
So what prompted you to do this film?
Well, most of the documentaries that I've done have focused on people and places and issues in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. So, of course, as a documentary filmmaker, I'm always looking for my next idea. And for several years, I had been actually reading about community gardens and collecting articles about them. And I was really interested in learning about the role that these gardens played in people's lives, in their neighborhoods, in their surrounding environment. And I was interested in learning why people garden at community gardens, who were these people that gardened, what were the challenges that they faced, what do these gardens offer cities. And so that's really the reason why I decided to go ahead and explore this. I started working on it in March of 2007, and I'm still in production. And it took me actually 2 seasons to cover all the 7 different gardens that I am featuring in the documentary. So I needed to go through 2 spring and summer seasons to capture.
And these are all in
everything.
Washington, D.C.?
They're all in D.C.
And all
right.
around the city, all the different quadrants?
Yes, all around the city. Exactly.
Okay, well, why don't we take a look at and see what Cynthia's seen?
Being in Washington, D.C. and being here, you would know that just a few hundred yards on the other side, there's murder and crime and everything. It's just so quiet and peaceful back here. So that's what I like about being in the garden.
There's no community food projects in Washington, D.C., in the nation's capital. To let a piece of land just go fallow like this and not make it a productive food garden was just motivating in itself.
The garden plays a big role in my life because it feeds me. You know, I live out of this garden. Whatever I get every Wednesday, that's what feeds me for the whole week. I live Wednesday to Wednesday. So, you know, without the garden, I wouldn't have any food.
What keeps me here is my mom's motivation. My mom keeps telling me, Nasir, you always have to come out to the garden to get some work done.
Oh, sweet! What? Oh, hey! Stop by. Go on, man. Okay.
I'm growing basil, and I'm growing wonderful tomatoes, and those golden peppers that you're paying $4 a pound for in the grocery store, I'm growing those.
Ooh, I smell that too. Okay, I want you to smell this over here. Close your eyes.
It broadens my classroom, it expands my classroom. It gives me another tool to work with. Everything can't come out of a book, especially with students with special needs. You really have to work with their senses.
Hi, Tariana. Why don't you come on over? You're just in time to help me plant.
I plant miracles, and I watered the flower bed. I just like the fresh air.
My parents live in Albania, and when they come to visit, there's a total restructuring of the garden.
Jam shumë I gëzuar. Jeta ka krijuar një kopsht. Kjo është vazhdimësia e traditës dhe zakonit shqiptar.
Bueno, eso viene de la sangre porque en mi país se vive de la agricultura.
Ooh, I love it. When I see the corn, I think I'm in Africa.
I come out here and I just sit and I don't think about my sickness. It goes away, and after I gather my vegetables and stuff and go home, I don't think about me being sick anymore.
When we last gathered together this past September, we celebrated the planting of a seed. That seed, or notion, was how a park and garden could create a vibrant sense of community on this now vacant lot.
I always had called this the $1 million dumpster corner because the property itself only housed a dumpster. Hopefully this will integrate the property back into the fabric of the community in a constructive way that brings us together. And that's why I'm so happy.
It's definitely a community full of people who just love to be near nature and doing something with their hands and getting their hands dirty, and at the end of the day having something on their table that they grew themselves.
Terrific. So, who do you see as the audience for this film?
I think that there's a really big audience for the film. I think there's a really big movement now for local food and community gardens. And the documentary is going to show how these gardens, beyond the fresh produce that they provide gardeners, are also places of healing for people who are undergoing personal difficulties. They're outdoor classrooms for kids and for adults as well. They're links for immigrants to their native countries. They're oases of beauty and calm in inner city neighborhoods. So it encompasses so many different facets of community gardens that I see nonprofit organizations, grassroots organizations, environmental organizations, even places like hospitals or medical clinics that maybe want to have a garden to help people in terms of healing. Schools, libraries, parks and recreation departments. I see a really wide audience that would be interested in it. Are you a gardener yourself? I'm not a gardener myself,
Are you
actually.
intrigued now, having done this? Do you want to become a gardener?
What I've learned from going out and producing this is that it takes a lot of work to have a garden, and especially to have a plot at a community garden, because you're not stepping out to your backyard garden. You actually have to make a trip to go there. So I think that you really have to love it and want to do it, and it takes a lot of work. One of the gardeners talks about that in the documentary.
And how big are these plots typically?
The plots really range in sizes. Some of them are very small. Some of them are,
Does everybody
10 by
get
10.
the same size in the same garden?
Usually they do get the same size in the garden that they're in.
And is there a waiting list to get these?
For some of these gardens, there's a huge waiting list. That's one of the issues that I'm going to address in the documentary. In fact, one garden has about over 90 people on the waiting list, and they're just clamoring to get there. That's the Melvin Hazen Community Garden, which is in DC, in the northwest quadrant of DC. So I'm actually profiling a young couple that's so desperate to get a plot, and they're on the waiting list, that they're actually offering to help other gardeners with their plots because they really want to get their hands dirty. So they volunteer to help for other gardeners.
Now, I noticed one of the people that you interviewed uses the plot for subsistence, that this is what they have to eat.
Exactly.
Is that common?
It's not. It's one of the gardens that I'm featuring in the documentary. It's not common throughout Washington, D.C. It does happen throughout the country. And the gardens that I'm featuring are each unique because they might have a different mission. They might attract a different segment of the population. This garden was originally called the 7th Street Garden. They've now moved to a new location called Common Good City Farm. And their purpose is to provide fresh produce to low-income DC residents. So people who are eligible garden, they work there, and in return for their work in the garden, they receive fresh fruits and vegetables.
Okay, so when is this film going to be completed?
I'm currently editing several segments. I'm doing historical research for a segment on the history of community gardens in the U.S., and I'm waiting for a vacant lot to be transformed into a community park and garden. Hopefully that will all happen by the summer of 2010. That's when I really would like to have the documentary completed. But of course I have to wait for this vacant lot to be transformed into a garden.
Well, many thanks to Cintia Cabib for sharing her fascinating film project with us. If you want to learn more, visit Cynthia's website for this film, communityofgardeners.com. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been Rewind.
Some folks worry about yesterday. They measure each moment by mistakes they've made. For some, the future is a cold, dark fear, always frightening, 'cause it's ever near. But take 1 minute and search your soul. Are you living or just growing old? Or are you wishing upon some star, staying stuck right where you are? That was a long time coming, I'll be a long time gone. I'm gonna make my mark for a move along. Call a carpe diem for what you may. I do my living each and every day. Is your life busy? Is it a drag? Sitting in traffic or some shopping bags? Is it a pity or just a bore? You gotta ask yourself what you're doing it for. I was a long time coming, I'll be a long time gone. I'm gonna make my mark for a move along. Call a carpe diem or what you may. I do my living each and every day. There's no use waiting for a sunny day, or the phone to ring, or the numbers to pay. You gotta make it happen, put it on the line, or you're left empty and you're wasting your time. I was a long time coming, I'll be a long time gone. I'm gonna make my mark for a move along. Call a carpe diem for what you may. I do my living each and every day. I do my living each and every day.
Welcome, sir.
Thank you, David.
Pleasure to have you on the musical traditions segment.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here.
We had a funny meeting, didn't we?
We did. Years ago.
That's right. And let's see, I had an ad up for a housemate.
That's right, and I need a place to live.
And you didn't know me, and I didn't know you, and everything went pretty smoothly.
Until I think I mentioned the banjo.
And you said, yeah, and you know, so I'll be practicing it a whole lot, and it's kind of loud. Right. And I thought, yeah.
I think you put the kibosh on that, right?
Yeah. So, and then I guess what, we met up a year or so later, and we said, oh yeah, I remember.
That's right.
You were playing in a band then called Rock Creek with
right.
Moondy Klein.
That's right. That's right.
And let's see. Then after that was Roadside Attraction.
Bluegrass band called Roadside Attraction. That's right.
And then you stepped into a solo career here.
Yeah, I took a few years off. I didn't play. I found myself in a terrible mood. And my wife actually told me if I didn't start playing again, she'd divorce me. So that was,
boot me out
of the house because I was being such a pain. And I started, I've been writing a lot of songs, and I kind of decided to do the solo singer-songwriter thing.
In the other bands, in Rock Creek and Roadside Attraction, were they doing much of your material? Or?
They were doing a fair amount of it, which is great, but I found that I really wanted to try to give some treatment, special treatment of stuff I'd already written, and that didn't necessarily need a bluegrass setting. So.
The song that you just played, that's on your album. In fact, that's the title of it.
Title cut of my current CD. It's called Each and Every Day.
You got another one for us?
We're going to do what we call in the business a moaner.
A moaner.
A moaner.
Explain.
A moaner is a sad song.
A ballad, a tearjerker.
A tearjerker.
All right. Well, I'll go over there, grab my handkerchief.
Grab your handkerchief and your antidepressants. Probably only need those too. This is it's a song I wrote about 5 years ago called In Loving Memory of You. Sometimes when days go badly, I take a walk alone in the cool and quiet solitude of the churchyard near our home, a place where dreams and joys and fears have all been laid to rest. its old white marble tombstone stands. It's all that there is left. And sometimes I wonder, had life gone differently, would I be standing here alone with you so far away? For the death of our bodies we must somehow accept, but the end of love before its time leaves an ocean of regrets. In loving memory of you, I'll live out my days alone, through each long night till dawn. In loving memory of you. Our friends, they introduce me to the latest gal in town. They say it's time to let you go, let a new love bring me around. But I made a vow so long ago, before our hair turned gray. I'll love you every moment until my dying day. In loving memory of you, I'll live out my days alone, through each long night until dawn. In loving